All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Great Decisions lecture series. This is lecture number 4 of 6 in our series this year. This lecture series was designed by the Foreign Policy Association with the intent to inspire discussions on world issues. Our series is in partnership with the American Association of University Women and with BGSU professors. I would first like to introduce you to our speaker today and then to the topic that she will be discussing for us. So Dr. Shannon Orr is here with us today. She is a professor of political science and the graduate coordinator of the Master of Public Administration program at BGSU. She is the author of 2 books and is currently finishing a 3rd on Asian Carp and the Great Lakes. Her new research area is looking at food insecurity among university students. Dr. Orr has been using civic engagement in her classroom for many years, and her graduate students have completed more than 100 projects for local community clients, including Bowling Green Parks and Recreation, the Toledo Zoo, Ronald McDonald House Charities, the City of Bowling Green, and many others. Results of those projects have led to successful grant funding, local, regional, and national media coverage, and even have been included in reports to Congress. In her spare time, she enjoys curling, taking tap dance classes, and watching the Great British Baking Show with her husband and 13-year-old daughter, Bella. Today, Dr. Orr will be discussing struggles over the melting Arctic. US President Donald Trump left many scratching their heads when it was rumored that he was looking to purchase the large island nation of Greenland from Denmark. While any political deal seems highly unlikely, the event shows the changing opinion within the US government toward engagement with the Arctic region. Because of climate change, large sheets of Arctic ice are melting, exposing vast stores of natural gas and oil. With Russia and China already miles ahead with their Arctic strategies, can the US catch up? Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Dr. Orr, and for discussing this topic with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me back to Great Decisions. I think this is actually my 10th time presenting at Great Decisions, and it's something I look forward to every year. And this year it's a little different, so thank you for welcoming me into your living rooms. It's a different format than last year, but I'm glad to see so many people who are here. So I'm going to share my screen in theory. Hold on one sec. Now I will share my screen. All right, can you all see that? Okay. So I'm really excited to be joining you today and to talk about struggles over the melting Arctic. Last year, I got to present at Great Decisions on climate change right before kind of COVID struck. So this is kind of exciting to be able to come and do like the follow-up. So expanding on that topic and talking about the Arctic and melting sea ice. And we're going to talk a lot about national security. So climate change has been one of my research areas for years. I actually did my doctoral dissertation on the United Nations and climate change. And at the time, I was living in Calgary. I'm Canadian, and I was living in Calgary, and my husband and I went for a hike. And we were in Jasper National Park. And hopefully some of you have been there or get the chance to go there once COVID is over and lockdowns are lifted and the borders open again. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. And you can walk out onto the Athabasca Glacier. And it's free. You walk. You can also take some like snow buses to go farther along the glacier. And what struck me, we were up on at one point we were kind of looking down at the glacier, and I was struck by 2 things. And one was just the crowds of people walking on the glacier. And there were markers, and you could see how much the glacier had been melting and retreating over the years. They were losing about 5 meters per year because of climate change. And it was kind of interesting to think about. This is, not just kind of nature and nature changes. And but it was interesting from a Parks Canada perspective, because this is a major tourism draw for people to be able to go and easily access this glacier and walk on it. And so there's some pretty interesting economic impacts of this melting glacier for Jasper National Park. And so then I started to get kind of interested in climate change and reading more about it, and developed into this many year research project. So I've been pretty lucky. I've actually been able to go to 3 of the United Nations climate change treaty negotiations. So I went to the first one the first one I went to was in India. And that was part of my dissertation research. And then I also went to the negotiations in Copenhagen. And you've heard about the Paris Agreement, the climate change in Paris a lot in the news. Well, I was actually there, and I actually got to bring 4 students with me. And so they got to participate and watch and attend sessions and meet lots of government representatives and people all over the world during the treaty negotiations. So it was a pretty fabulous experience for them. And depending on COVID, I'm actually hoping to go to the next round. So there's a new climate change treaty negotiated every year. The Paris is the really big one. And then there's kind of like follow-up ones that are still being negotiated. And so the next meeting will be in Scotland in October. So depending on COVID, if that is still on, I'm planning to go and wrap up the last of my climate change research and then move on to some other areas. So what I want to get into really briefly, we're just going to talk a little bit about, why is Arctic ice melting, just as kind of a background to then getting into the really interesting issues. So this is a graph that pretty dramatically graphically represents the changing average sea ice in the Arctic. So from 1980 through to 2016, and the graph continues today downward. You can see a pretty distinctive melting of the sea ice, that the sea ice is receding. And this has been really well documented by internationally, the US Geological Society, the State Department, lots of the measurements all consistently show that, and this is data just looking at January. So in January is when you should see the most Arctic sea ice. It melts throughout the year. But comparing January to January, you can see a pretty significant melting pattern over the year. So just really briefly, and hopefully some of you were at the climate change talk last year when we talked more in depth about what climate change is. But my favorite analogy that I use when I teach students about climate change is that if we imagine the Earth as like a car on a warm, sunny day, and you open the door, you've left your car at the grocery store, it's super hot, you open the door and you're hit by that blast of heat, and it's even hotter on the inside than it is on the outside. And what's happened, right, is that the sun's energy has passed through the windshield, through the windows of your car, but the heat doesn't all leave. It gets trapped inside the car. And that's, in a very kind of quick overview way, that's basically what climate change is. So the atmosphere here in this picture is filled with greenhouse gases, lots of them naturally occurring from volcanoes and cows and natural plant processes. But we add more and more gases, transportation, industry, lots of just day-to-day human life. We put lots more greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere, and they don't really go anywhere. They just kind of collect in the atmosphere. And so that's like the body of the car. And so as we add more and more greenhouse gases, as we have more factories, as we have more, use more fossil fuels, we put more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that body of the car gets kind of thicker and thicker, or the blanket gets thicker and thicker. There's lots of ways to kind of think about those greenhouse gases up there in the atmosphere. And then the sun rays come through, they hit the earth, and the heat gets trapped by that blanket, by the outside of the car. And so, kind of the basic mechanics of it would say that as we add more greenhouse gas emissions up into the atmosphere, we're going to just end up trapping more and more heat. And it's just like a hot car on a summer day. So there are, lots of, we're not going to talk about solutions or whatnot, but there are lots of ideas and strategies and policies and whatnot to try and deal with that. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the politics of what it means living in a world of climate change, and specifically focusing on the impact of the melting sea ice in the Arctic. So this is where we get into the good stuff. So we're going to leave all the science stuff aside, and we're going to focus on life in the Arctic. And so we have some major players in the Arctic. And when we talk about the Arctic, we're talking about the area that's north of the Arctic Circle. So not a lot of population, but pretty critically important in terms of security, navigation, fishing, fossil fuels, and we're going to get into all of that today. So when we talk about the Arctic nations, so these are the countries who are part of the Arctic Circle. So the US is one of them because of Alaska, Canada. We have Denmark because of Greenland. So Greenland is an independent territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. So because of that relationship, Denmark is an Arctic nation. Norway, Russia, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. So the region is made up of lots of snow and lots of ice. And just the very fact of their latitude is what brings them together. But that region is made up of such different politics. And it's amazing to think about, when we try and think about one region that has so many issues and problems in common, but we have so many different politics, we have so many different cultures, we have so many different economics and social interests all combined into this one region. We also have a really strong indigenous presence. The Inuit populations, but they are made up of many different groups of indigenous people who are very different and share very different cultural backgrounds and very different traditions and very different social experiences. Russia has the largest Arctic population. And so that's something that's pretty important to keep in mind as we move forward. But we're talking about a region that's united by location, snow and ice, but is very, very different politically. And we're starting to see this Arctic region becoming more important, and we see a lot of potential. And as the sea ice starts to melt, suddenly the Arctic region becomes more accessible. And that's where we get into the kind of the good political stuff that's going on. So melting sea ice in the Arctic, as I showed you with that graph, it's happening. It has really important consequences for wildlife, for fisheries, for the livelihoods of those who live in the Arctic. As I said, I'm originally from Canada, and I have like a really short little anecdote because a family friend of ours who lives up in the Arctic, he lives in Nunavut and is an ice road trucker. So if you've ever seen the TV show Ice Road Truckers, he's been on it. And so he does transportation, driving a truck year round, but particularly in the winter when the ice is frozen and you can drive across the ice. So you can actually do a lot of your transportation and a lot of kind of moving of people and supplies happens in the winter when the ice is frozen, because then you don't have to go around large bodies of water. You don't have to use boats. It's cheaper than using helicopters or planes or whatnot. However, when the spring hits, the ice starts to melt. And so the ice road truckers all start to drive with their doors open. So in case they hear the ice cracking and the ice starts to melt, they can jump out of their truck and hopefully save their lives but they sacrifice their truck as it sinks into the cracking ice. So one of the concerns for transportation and for our family friend is that the melting sea ice, the ice is melting sooner. And so he can't get as much work anymore because the roads are melting earlier. And so he's losing about a month's worth of work because of the melting sea ice. So he's living and seeing this every single day. During the winter is when a lot of people are able to access medical services because they can take a snowmobile across the ice and get to a hospital much cheaper and easier than having to take a helicopter. Same with schooling. There are kids who, it's much easier for them to get to school if they can shoot across on a snowmobile to a school than in the summer when those, and spring, summer, and early fall, when those roads are just lakes and rivers and water. So just in those like little anecdotal stories, right, the melting sea ice is already having a huge impact on the day-to-day lives of people living in the Arctic. So looking historically at the politics. So this is a Soviet Cold War submarine called the Black Widow. During the Cold War, the Arctic region was pretty important for geopolitical reasons. The North Pole was the shortest route between the US and Soviet Union for delivering a nuclear attack. And so there was a lot of military development took place in the Arctic, a lot of development of tracking systems to be able to identify and track incoming missiles. In 1957, US and Canada created NORAD, which is the North American Air Defense Command. In 1981, they changed it to aerospace to take into account the growing concerns about military uses of outer space. But the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, was created specifically to deal with the threat of the Soviet Union, and there was a significant emphasis put on how Canada and the US could use the Arctic region for defense. So they weren't just concerned, though, about missiles coming through the air. They were also really worried about submarines coming under the ice. And so there was a lot of technological development around things like sonar and tracking and identifying movements under the ice that were not whales, were not seals, but would be submarines. And so the Soviet Union invested a lot of money in developing better submarine technology, specifically going under the ice as a way to stage an attack on the United States, if necessary, coming from under the ice using submarines. So this development of technology and military strategy taking place in the Arctic region was a really significant part of the Cold War. So then we get to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, which means suddenly the Arctic region, there's not a lot of tension anymore. And so all of those military investments, the stations, the commands, most of those were shut down. Many of them were literally just abandoned. So in the Soviet Union, Russia and Canada and the US and the Arctic, there are all these old relics of Cold War military installations. And it was too expensive to bring them back down to the lower 48. So they literally just abandoned them and left them. And there's not a lot of people there to notice or care. So we have the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have the end of the Cold War. And so suddenly now the Arctic is less of a concern from a military perspective. So all of that investment in money and focus goes away, pretty much. So now we're in the post-Cold War era. And suddenly when we start, the governments start thinking about Arctic and Arctic policy, instead of focusing on nuclear weapons and defense and submarine technology, there's suddenly what we call a focus on like soft security, which is really about sustainable development. So things like protecting the Arctic. So the development of protected zones in the Arctic, navigation safety. So using the waterways, the Northwest Passage, and figuring out how to navigate ships through that despite all the ice, which is a major threat for the shipping industry. So figuring out how to improve navigation, how to use the Arctic as shorter shipping routes, but how to do so safely. So lots of technological development around icebreakers, for example. And then also like a new recognition and concern about Indigenous people and the general populations who live in the Arctic regions. So things like economic development, jobs is a huge issue. I actually, before I came to Beach Issue, I worked as a policy analyst and in Calgary. And one of my areas was natural gas pipelines and in the Arctic. So, and it's a fascinating topic. And sometimes I get all excited in class and start telling my students all about our natural gas pipelines in the Arctic. And they don't quite find it as exciting and interesting as I do. But but it's an interesting, there's so many interesting policy issues around that, around things like job creation and protecting the environment, natural environment from leaks. And what do you do if you build a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline, and the caribou can't migrate around it? They can't go over it, they can't go under it. So now you've got this pipeline running across the tundra, and the caribou can't get around it. So what do you do? And fun fact, you boost it up, and so that they can go under it. Or if it's not frozen, you run the pipelines underground, so then the caribou can walk through them. Although the caribou kind of like the pipelines because they're warm, so they sometimes you see video of like the caribou kind of snuggling up against them and getting a little warm. But these are the issues that we're thinking about in the post-Cold War era. So in 1996, the Arctic Council was formed, and the Arctic Council was made up of the 8 Arctic nations, plus 6 organizations representing Indigenous people. And so the idea here was that, in contrast to the Cold War, where it's everyone for themselves, and we're in a zero-sum game, there's one winner. Now we're talking about Arctic cooperation and really focusing on developing the region as a whole. So if any of you have been, for example, on an Alaskan cruise, I want to hear all about it in our discussion, because so much of that cruise industry is complicated and there's lots of politics around it, but a lot of it has been trying to help to develop the Arctic region, to bring money into the area, to try and create jobs and those kinds of things. It's not without its controversies, but it's kind of an interesting approach in this post-Cold War Arctic cooperation era. So here are the Arctic nations, and you can see that the U.S. Is represented by Alaska. You can see the strong geographic presence of Russia. You see the strong presence of Norway, somewhat of Sweden, Iceland and Finland, and Canada. And Canada's kind of when you look at the map, right, you can really see that Canada has some interesting challenges. There's this beautiful Northwest Passage that runs right through Canada, and is a very, much quicker shipping route when you're talking about the northern region. But Canada is made up of so much coastline because we have all of these little islands. And so when I was talking about the melting of the ice roads, you can really see in this picture that when the when the water is frozen, that becomes kind of one landmass. But then when it melts, suddenly we have all of these really isolated islands, land masses. And so people who are living on these are really disconnected and very, very isolated and very dependent now on expensive helicopters, float planes, those kinds of things. So winter in Canada is much better for the people who live there in terms of being able to get off their land masses, their islands, and being able to access more services. Even things like grocery stores become inaccessible in the summer months. So I think that this map gives a really good picture of why this matters and why we're dealing with such interesting politics, because we have so many different interests all combined into this one region. So what's interesting, so the Arctic Council, created in 1996, it kind of marks a new way of a formal, institutionalized new way of thinking about the region as one of cooperation. However, the Arctic Council decided to expand. So initially, it was only made up of countries that were actually in the Arctic. Now, they've allowed 13 non-Arctic nations to join. They can't vote on decisions, but they're there, they're at the meetings, they have a voice. They're called observers, but they're there. And it's interesting when you look at the list of countries. So now we have China. So China, not an Arctic nation, is part of the Arctic Council and is doing its best to influence policymaking within these Arctic nations. We have France, Germany, India is a member, a non-voting member, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Poland, Singapore, Korea, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK. So we see, suddenly we have four Asian countries involved in Arctic decision making, and a strong presence from the European Union and plus the UK. So we don't see, as of yet, any representation from Latin America or from the Middle East or from Africa. It will be really interesting to see if that changes and if those regions also start to develop an interest in the Arctic, particularly as with the melting sea ice, we start to see more and more opportunities, and particularly opportunities for economic development and exploitation. So, all right, so this is the situation. We've got Arctic nations, but now we have all of these non-Arctic countries who are getting involved and trying to have a say in what happens in the North. So now we're going to get into the politics. So the politics of melting sea ice and some of the really key issue areas that we're dealing with. So the first one is navigation. So this is a Russian icebreaker. So one of the good things about melting sea ice is that it's opening up the Arctic. If you are in the shipping industry or in manufacturing and you want to use the Northwest Passage, you want to use northern shipping routes, this is a really good thing that the sea ice is melting. So some of these routes that you could never navigate or that were really only navigable for like a really short period of time in the summer, suddenly now those are open. And they will continue to open because we don't see any reason why the sea ice is going to stop melting. It's still not easy. There's still, giant chunks of ice. Insurance costs for shipping is astronomical because of the risk to the ships and to the crews who are navigating through the North because there is still so much ice. And there's also often shipping delays, so you can end up trapped in the ice or you can't get through. So many of these ships are using icebreakers. So an icebreaker goes ahead of you and your ship follows behind, and the icebreaker breaks up the ice so that you can travel through it. They're expensive to use if you're a private company, but they can ensure a smooth passageway through the ice. So as the ice continues to melt, though, there'll be less and less of a need for icebreakers. So challenges ahead for the Arctic community. So I just really briefly wanted to touch on not just the kind of the social politics of the Arctic community and what melting sea ice means. So in Northern Canada, so this is just a simple jug of orange juice, which is about $5 at Kroger. But in Northern Canada, it's $26 for that simple jug of orange juice. And the average cost in 2019 to feed a family of 4 in Northern Canada, a relatively healthy meal, so not just Kraft Dinner or macaroni and cheese every day, was $422.07 per week. In the rest of Canada, in Southern Canada, in the provinces, it's $220. So to give you a sense, and it's because of transportation costs, primarily, that food in the northern communities is so expensive. The Canadian government continues to try and figure out how to deal with this, or subsidies and whatnot. But you know, just the simple fact that so little food is produced in the north causes a really high cost of food. And this is not unique to Canada. I just happened to pull this picture from Canada, but it's true in all of the northern communities. And part of the challenge is the transition away from Indigenous native food, and the current the idea that the current generation has lost some of those traditional ways of hunting and gathering. And so there is actually a movement in the Arctic region, and this is something that the Arctic Council is dealing with, is trying to reintroduce those native food experiences, to teach hunting and to teach fishing again, so that people are not as dependent on food that's coming from you know, the lower 48, that they can be more sustainable by creating their by moving back to local food sources. 7 in 10 Inuit preschoolers are food insecure. So this is, there's a new food bank that's been opened in the north in Canada, that's actually there's a northern mosque in Northern Canada, which is a partner with a mosque in Toronto. And so they have opened a food bank to try and support people who are food insecure in the region. So, and melting the ice in general has a big impact on everyday life. So it impacts where you can live, it impacts how you can travel. And so this is a huge adjustment for people living in the Arctic region. So fishery impacts. So this is a commercial fishing boat. And fishing is kind of an interesting case study when we think about the Arctic and melting sea ice. So we see some species of fish are already moving farther north, trying to find colder water. So we're already starting to see new fish appearing in the Arctic region who were never there before, because the waters are warmer. And so down farther south, and so they're seeking the cold water fish, and so they're moving farther north. So that's a good thing for northern fishing. Not so good for southern fishing, but good for northern fishing. And as we've seen globally, fishing stocks have declined due to overfishing. We have new opportunities for Arctic fishing because of the opening of the sea ice. So, you know, some people are worried about overfishing will happen there, but the idea that this creates new job opportunities, economic development as the sea ice melts, it's easier to fish, and you can fish longer. So it's kind of that trade-off, right? So the ice road trucking industry is being shortened because of the melting sea ice, but now we've got the shipping and fishing industries can go longer. So we kind of have this really interesting kind of dance, economic development dance going on in the Arctic because of the melting sea ice. So one of the biggest issues confronting the Arctic Council right now is about drilling for oil in the Arctic. The USGS, the US Geological Survey, has predicted that there are 90 billion barrels of oil in the Arctic. Now, the Arctic, we're talking about an immense region. Over 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And I have a window open and BGSU is plowing. Oh no, okay, I think they just moved away. Okay, I was gonna have to close my window. 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. So now the challenge is we don't actually have the technology right now to drill that deep and under the Arctic conditions to get to the oil and the natural gas. However, fossil fuel companies are definitely keeping a close eye on it and thinking about the future and thinking about the opportunities that could be created by the melting sea ice. And at what point does it make financial sense to start investing and developing that new technology? So, Shell just made an announcement saying that, we had reached peak oil. And so at a certain point, as the easy oil is, drilled and we start to think about, doing more things like fracking and using the tar sands out in Western Canada and Arctic drilling, when the price of oil reaches a high enough point, these things start to make economic sense. And I've done some great interviews with representatives from Shell and BP at the climate change negotiations, because they are there and they are very active. They are, definitely looking at exploring their options, huge investments in alternative energy, kind of looking at the forward to the point when, natural gas, oil is not renewable. At a certain point, you have to run out. And so then, the easy stuff to get. So then, things like drilling for oil in the Arctic on a much larger scale start to make sense. But you have a lot of challenges, right? And particularly dealing with, things like pipelines and how do you get the oil and natural gas from these Arctic regions, and how do you get them to, processing and production and to consumers? So, and you're still dealing with these really harsh Arctic conditions. So this was some of the work that I did as a policy analyst, was looking specifically at Arctic natural gas pipelines and the challenges, the policy challenges that are inherent in that. So moving on to look at security issues. And so security, is, really focusing on military and defense. And also, increasingly, we're combining economic development in with security too. And the most important thing that I want you to keep in mind about the Arctic region, right, is that what we're really dealing with here are very much competing interests among these different regions. So if we start with the United States is technically an Arctic nation. But politically, we don't really act like it. Most Americans have no connection to the Arctic. Even most Alaskans don't actually live in the Arctic circle part of the state. It's not a key part of the American identity. So it's very interesting for me, having moved here from Canada when I was an adult, because I moved from Canada to take a job at BGSU. And Northern life, the Arctic is very much a part of the Canadian identity, even if we don't go there. We all know people who live in the Arctic. The Arctic news is just a daily feature of national, the national news broadcasts. We always hear the news about what's going on in the Arctic. Policy decisions always take into account both, the southern provinces and northern Canada. So taxes, internet access, all of those things, it's just a natural part of growing up in Canada, that we talk about Arctic politics a lot. Arctic politics is Canadian politics, just like Western Canada politics and Eastern Maritime politics and Quebec politics. So, but here in the United States, we don't have that same kind of political identity with the Arctic region, even though the US is technically an Arctic nation. And so you can really kind of see that in the ways in which the US has, kind of left Alaska, fairly independent. Alaska is a fairly wealthy state, and we haven't thought about it in terms of economic development issues or social development issues. We don't talk a lot about the Inuit indigenous peoples of Alaska down here in the lower 48. But in 2018, we started to see some really key changes politically, and we saw the government starting to think about the Arctic in more strategic terms. So when President Trump made his statement in 2019 that he was interested in buying Greenland, which is a territory of Denmark, and wasn't actually for sale, that was actually a statement about the growing strategic importance of the Arctic. And it really signified, for people who follow and study or engaged in Arctic politics, it was kind of a wake-up moment. And it was like, oh, okay, the Arctic is on the radar of the US government in a way that's very different than it used to be. And this idea that suddenly, maybe Alaska wasn't enough, and maybe the US needed to establish a stronger presence in the Arctic region, and in particular to claim more land and to claim more access to the Arctic. So just as a side note, the Law of the Sea, which is the international treaty that governs the oceans around the world, every nation controls 200 nautical miles beyond its coast. And so you have exclusive fishing, drilling, and mining rights. So 200 miles out from your coast. So, Russia can't come and fish off the coast of Florida unless the United States explicitly gives it permission to do so, because the US, it's called the exclusive economic zone. So the US controls 200 miles, nautical miles beyond its coast. So wait a minute, if we want to, quote unquote, buy Greenland, that would give us not only Greenland as a landmass, but it would also give us 200 nautical miles around it. And so this could be strategically important for drilling, for navigation, and for fishing. So this was kind of a key moment in thinking strategically about Arctic politics. So, the media kind of laughed at it, but people who are involved in Arctic politics really saw this as kind of a turning point, that we're not gonna just look at the Arctic in these soft security terms and it's all about sustainable development. Oh wait, maybe there's actually more to this and more opportunities, and the US needs to step up and become a major player. And a lot of this was also in reaction to China and China's growing presence in the Arctic, and Russia starting to build up, we're going to talk about that in a second, build up more of a presence in the Arctic. And suddenly the US is like, oh shoot, we need to catch up and we need to start asserting our own political strengths in the region as well. So the US Coast Guard is buying a huge new fleet of icebreakers, and that's all about the Arctic shipping. So we don't use those, down here in the South. Those are all about Arctic shipping. So that is a huge investment. The US currently has like one really old icebreaker that is in most use, and they're actually like it's not good. And so investing in buying a whole new fleet of icebreakers, that is a huge change in US policy. The US just reopened its consulate in Greenland, which had been closed since 1953. So now they're establishing a US government presence in Denmark, in Greenland, so that they have, more access to negotiating, more of an influence with Arctic policy beyond just, their position in Alaska. In 2020, the State Department announced that it now has a U.S. coordinator for the Arctic region. That position had not been filled for the last 3 or 4 years. And so that person, James DeHart, said, our objectives for the region are that it be peaceful and an area of low tension, and that there be close cooperation among the nations of the Arctic. And that's a pretty significant political statement to make, right? It's laying out the ground rules, and it's a signal to, particularly to Russia, right, that this is a peaceful region, and that the official policy position is that the US is not going to tolerate an escalation of military tensions in the Arctic. So it seems like so it's much more than just kind of a peaceful, let's all get along statement. No, it's a clear message to Russia not to engage, no military shenanigans in the Arctic region. So does Russia care? Well, so what I did is I've pulled together a bunch of headlines from the last week or so about the Arctic and security. So one of the headlines was, new kind of Cold War as US extends competition with China and Russia to the Arctic. So Russia sees the Arctic as highly strategically important. The Russian Arctic, so that they already have access to, has really important oil and gas reserves. And as you know, oil and gas is critical and essential to the Russian economy. And so they're highly dependent on fossil fuels economically, right, and exports, and they use that politically. And so they are going to do everything they can to protect their fossil fuel interests in the Arctic. And as the melting sea ice, as the sea ice continues to melt and they can get access to more reserves, they are going to maximize that. And so they are looking to turn the Arctic into a major liquefied natural gas producing region. And they have determined politically that they have to maintain a constant military presence in the Arctic. So they have they have invested in a new northern naval fleet that they have moved into position. They have also invested in new icebreakers, and they have developed airfields in their region of the Arctic. And so they are looking very strategically, and they have already filed complaints about their 200 nautical miles that they control. They are trying to extend those. They are trying to claim as much access as they can to mineral rights, to drilling rights in the Arctic region. So China, so this is a headline, China has big plans to dominate the Arctic. So in 2018, China published its very first Arctic policy, and it called itself a near Arctic state. Like, we're basically Arctic, but even though we're not Arctic, we're basically Arctic. And they are claiming that because they are near Arctic, they should have voting rights on the Arctic Council, and that they should have a greater influence in Arctic policy. They are, have their eyes on, particularly on trade routes and on access to resources. It's interesting, they've also established some big scientific field stations in the Arctic. they're actively studying climate change. China is very worried about the impact of climate change on its own economy, and particularly its coastal cities. So they're using they have partnered with other countries, Denmark, Finland, to do a lot of climate change research. Although there's a lot of concerns that those scientists are also Chinese spies. Or military people there's a strong military presence among the scientists at those field stations. So they've been talking about a future polar Silk Road. So oil and gas exploration, mining. They're very interested in rare earth metals that will be accessible with the melting sea ice, which they need to support their electronics industry. And fishing and shipping. So Denmark ramps up Arctic naval defense spending. So now we've got Denmark in it too, right? You can't be left behind. And so we see Denmark starting to expand its military spending in the Arctic region. So why is the US more involved now? So the US and Russia are in this ongoing battle about access to trade and shipping routes. Russia said it has the right to control who goes through the Northern Sea route, and the US says it doesn't. And the Russia's claim is like, well, it's for safety. Like, we have the icebreakers and we want to make sure nobody gets stuck. And the US is like, you don't care about that. Cold War vibes as US shows military muscle in Norway. This was another recent headline. The US is very worried about China and China's involvement, and in particular that China won't play by the rules. And China is expanding its political influence by investing in other Arctic countries. There is concern that they will establish a permanent military presence, either because a country will allow them to set up a base in the Arctic, or because they'll be hidden as workers. China built an observatory in Iceland for the Northern Lights. Super exciting. People were like, very positive, because it's a way to bring in tourism, and Northern Lights tourism is a huge thing in Asia. But it was actually concerned that it was actually all about intelligence gathering, that the idea of the Northern Lights Observatory was just a facade, and that really China built an intelligence gathering observatory in Iceland. And as many of these Arctic economies are starting to look for economic development and job prospects, China is stepping up to create them. So, just like, Chinese investors buying up land in the United States and factories and homes, the same thing happening in the Arctic region as well. So growing military activity in Arctic could throw world back to Cold War, says a Russian diplomat. So US strategy. So US is trying to give Greenland development aid. So renewable energy, fisheries, tourism development, we're giving them basically cold hard cash to try and establish a stronger alliance with Greenland. When have we ever cared about Greenland or Denmark as a strategic ally? Suddenly, in the last few years, it's become more important. Norway actually invited the US to send Marines to train so that they could get experience in cold weather military fighting, which is one of the areas that Norway is really known for. Ongoing collaborations with Canada. The US military is pretty weak in terms of Arctic fighting. And so they've been trying to expand and their alliances, expand their training opportunities, working with Canada, working with Norway, in order to have troops who are ready, if need be, to engage in military fighting in the Arctic. So is that actually a concern? I don't, no one really knows. The position is better to be prepared because the US is so far behind in thinking about the Arctic from a strategic perspective. So, in conclusion, we can see the melting sea ice is about so much more than polar bears. And I was going to put up a picture, of the polar bear floating on the little piece of ice. And I know you've all seen that, but it seemed a little too cheesy, even for me. And I love cheesy. But, when we think about melting sea ice, we're talking about so much more than polar bears. We're talking about navigation. We're talking about drilling. We're talking about fishing. We're talking about, indigenous peoples and food pantries. And we're talking about national security. So thank you, everybody. And I really appreciate your attention and your invitation for me to come and get all excited about talking about melting sea ice. So I can turn things over to, my goal was to finish by 10:30, which I did, so we have lots of time.
Good. Yeah.
If people have questions or discussions.
Yeah, there is kind of a question in the chat feature. This person says, I believe that every president since Truman has offered to buy Alaska, so this is not something new. The real question is, why is Denmark not interested in selling Greenland? If it is a Viking thing, let me suggest that the US offer to buy everything north of 70 degrees in order to simplify the defense of the Arctic, and Greenland can keep the south part of Greenland in defense of Viking indigenous people and maintain fishing rights, etc.
That's a great question. And I think Greenland doesn't want to, Denmark doesn't want to sell Greenland because they see the opportunity, right? In terms of navigation, in terms of fishing, in terms of oil, like the idea of the economic development. I was at another treaty negotiation in Rio with the Sustainable Development negotiations, Rio +20, it was called. And Greenland, I actually got to go to a whole presentation that was hosted by Denmark about Greenland and sustainable development. And then we actually got a meal. It was one of the most amazing meals I've ever had. And it was using combining local ingredients from Greenland and Brazil in kind of innovative and cool ways. But it was really interesting to hear that, even though Greenland is much like the northern Canadian provinces struggles economically, they struggle with economic development. There's a lot of money, financial transfers that go between the federal government in Denmark to Greenland to try and support that future, the possibility that Greenland and Denmark sees that there is a lot of money to be made with the melting sea ice, and so they don't want to give that up.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? You are welcome to unmute yourself now or put them in the chat feature if you're more comfortable with that. If you're having trouble unmuting yourself, just give me a wave of your hand and I can ask you to unmute.
Shannon, thanks for your presentation. Really very informative and eye-opening too. We're looking at that map, and with the 200-mile geography or fishing rights, how does that work in the Bering Straits? It looks like they are almost overlapping.
Yeah, so that's why, when it was all frozen, it doesn't really matter. But now there is actually a process. So so Russia, the US, Canada have all filed arguments basically with the United Nations saying, okay, we get this area. And then Russia says, no, we get that area. And so it's all overlapping. And so, we're a number of years away from anyone being able to make a decision about that. But it's kind of like the old days of colonialism, right? When we had countries trying to divide up and pick, what countries were going to be your colonies, in dividing up, we look at the, Africa, Latin America, and who gets what. And so, and it's tough because the melting sea ice, people know like there are minerals down there and there is oil and natural gas, and we want to be able to fish and we want to be able to control, who goes through our waters. So yeah, it's a mess. And that's why this stuff has really started to ramp up as the sea ice has melted and as these things have become accessible. Suddenly all of the countries, it was just dramatic when, Trump made that statement and then the media jumped on it and stuff. But I mean, it was a wake-up call, but it was what's happening in the region, and who knows, right? I mean, that's going to be ugly if it doesn't, even when it does get resolved, right? Is Russia going to pay attention and follow, if they don't get the full access that they think they should? So but it wasn't an issue until the sea ice started to melt, because you couldn't use it.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions? Ellen, go ahead.
This is not totally to do with the Arctic, but kind of the world, but oil and gas, with General Motors saying that they're moving toward all electric cars in the next 15 years. There's going to be less demand for oil, although there's still going to have to be power plants to provide the electricity to charge up the electric cars. How does that fit into all this?
Yeah, so it's so fascinating, and one of the things I love. So when I go to these climate change negotiations, my research has all been about the politics of it, and specifically looking at how different interests. That's kind of my thing. So looking at how different interests engage with the treaty negotiations. Why is Shell Oil there? Why are ski resorts at these climate change negotiations? Why are wineries there? Right, maple syrup industry is super worried about climate change. Like the American maple syrup industry is really active in climate change politics because they're worried that their days are numbered as the winters get warmer, that they can't produce enough maple syrup. So Canada's loving it. The maple syrup industry is going to just grow. Canada's a good place. Canada's going to do much better with climate change. But so thinking about, we continue to need fossil fuels, and that the idea of that changing. I mean, despite my students so desperately wanting us to some of them just want to desperately move away from fossil fuels like tomorrow, and it's not possible, right? All of our global economies are built on fossil fuels, and that's not going to change very quickly. But what's going to happen is we're going to continue to see these transitions, right? And so you're going to see, the expansion of more solar panels, the expansions of more wind energy, and as those costs continue to come down, it makes economic sense. No one's going to do anything until it makes economic sense. And so, but the fact that we're going to run out of the easy oil and gas, and I've done interviews at the Paris negotiations with, all of the fossil fuels are really active at the climate change negotiations, and they run lots of panels and sessions, and they do cocktail hours and all sorts of stuff. They're really active, and and they're trying to figure out how do they continue to make their shareholders happy as it gets harder and harder to find the oil and natural gas. So ignoring the politics and policies of it, it's just the sheer access, right? And the fact that that's not renewable. And so I did this great interview with an executive from the oil company, and he was saying we've run out of the easy stuff that we can get that was really cheap. And so now that's why we're starting to see the fracking and the tar sands and the deep water drilling, because we wouldn't do any of that unless we had to. And so then naturally moving into, so it's like I think we're going to see some of those progressions, right? As the cost of oil and gas goes up because the easy stuff is gone, right? Then there becomes more, people are more interested in alternatives simply because of money. I mean, sure, there's less greenhouse gas emissions and that kind of stuff, but there are these really strong economic arguments that are being made at these negotiations that the future, we're and China is rapidly industrializing. Brazil, well, struggling, but rapidly industrializing. So we haven't even thought about the African continent, and we've got Kenya, Tanzania, economic development happening in those regions. They're we are seeing more cars, so we need more gas, right? We're seeing more air conditioning being put as we see a rising middle class in the African continent. And with the rising middle class comes increased demand and use of fossil fuels. So we're going to need more. Where do we get it, right? Or we need to, at the same time, do this transitioning and doing both, right? So we start to, we do all the oil and gas drilling that we can. And then at the same time, we do these transitions, right? So, I mean, BP, huge investor in alternative energy because they're looking 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road about how can they continue to make money. And at what point is it no longer economically feasible to drill? Where it's so expensive to get the oil and gas, and people have to be willing to pay for it.
Anyone else have any questions? Paul? Right, let me prompt you to unmute here.
I got it.
Got it? Okay, go ahead.
Shannon, you've presented a mind warp, I think, for a lot of us. That you presented, I think, the classic case of the power of a market and driving for profits versus the question of the social benefit or the broad community benefit of what happens to the world when there is climate change in a non-private focus. In these negotiations, how much discussion is there about the social issues, the need to have more control over climate change versus the dollar issue that you've made very strongly?
So, great question. And just FYI, Paul and I are on the same curling team. He's the greatest skip and the most patient curling skip in the history of curling skips. So
Thank you, Shannon.
you deserve that shout out. Yeah, so one of the things, and I'm so disappointed in all the media and the way the climate change negotiations get represented, because they are so comprehensive and fascinating. So you've got all of these very strong economic interests there, and people talking about, okay, what are the impacts of climate change, right? So we're talking about, okay, there are some really good things for some, if you're a northern shipping company, climate change is the best thing that could have ever happened to you. If you're an ice road trucker, this is devastating. And so, the climate change negotiations have strong representation by the Indigenous people, particularly coastal Indigenous people, so Arctic, Southern, all over, and talking about like, what's going to happen to us with rising sea levels or melting sea ice. And, can we talk about those and can we build those into these negotiations? And it's interesting because, now, so I went to my first negotiation in 2002. And so then the last one I was at was Paris. And I was supposed to go last year, but COVID canceled it, or this past year. And the transition in the discussion has been all about adaptation. So it used to be very much about, okay, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't matter if countries take an economic hit. And then it was like, okay, maybe it matters a little bit. Okay. And then people started to realize, like, we're making these targets. We're saying, okay, every country, you have to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by X amount. Every country is a little different. Some can actually increase because they don't have any. And if you're a developing country, you don't have to do anything. You just focus on developing. And then once you reach development, then you have to cut your greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to help you develop in a way that tries to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. But since I've been involved for the 18 years with these negotiations, no country has met their targets. I mean, so it's kind of like, well, that was a great idea, and every country agreed to it, right? Like the US said, yeah, we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, back down to 1990 levels. And every country agreed and said, yeah, we'll do it. And no country did it. And so the even though people still talk about this kind of stuff, like the Paris Agreement is kind of a nonsense document. And I have my students read it and they're all like, this doesn't really do anything. I mean, it's really not going to make much of it. Like, it's kind of weak. And they're like, they like to rewrite it. And they're like, well, this is what I would put in it. And I'm like, well, yeah, but you need the world to agree to it. and so, there's no enforcement. There's no penalties if you don't reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, other than you go to the UN, and everyone's like, oh, shoot, you didn't meet your targets. And then everyone's like, well, I didn't meet my targets either. And so the discourse has really changed to adaptation. So how do we adapt to climate change, and how do we mitigate the impacts? So how do we, what do we do for Indigenous people who now cannot access medical care 10 months out of 9 months out of the year because they can't use their snowmobiles safely to get to the hospital? So how do we deal with that problem? How do we deal with Bangladesh, right, with the immense amounts of flooding? And how do we help those people? What are we going to do for Tuvalu, right, which is predicted to be underwater, the first island nation that could actually be underwater? What are we as a planet going to do for this country of Tuvalu, which has contributed no greenhouse gas emissions, and yet it's going to be the ones to feel the problem, to suffer the impacts in a very dramatic way? So what are we as a planet going to do to try and address that issue? Do we have a responsibility to help them? And basically people say yes. And also Tuvalu is super small and they're very sweet and nice at the negotiations, so everybody wants to help Tuvalu. But what happens then when it's the next country, and then the next small island state, and what are we going to do, and how are we going to adapt to it? So I mean, and so though that's really kind of the how things have kind of changed. I mean, people still talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there's still, investments there's a green climate fund where to try and do like clean energy projects in developing countries and all that kind of stuff. But, when we hit the first economic crisis, things, there was a lot less enthusiasm for doing big, things. Now, with COVID, it'll be fascinating to see at the next negotiations. Like, I can't imagine countries stepping up and saying, yes, you know what we're going to do? We're going to stop investing in our factories, and we're going to, stop investing in manufacturing because of climate change. It's going to be like, how in the world can we support our economies, right, and help our people get jobs? Like and at the same time, though, people are saying, yeah, but the impacts of climate change are going to be devastating for millions of people. So how do we reconcile those two struggles?
I think you're making the classic point when we're trying to use market forces versus the very difficult task of trying to measure cost, social cost. How do you measure those social costs? And I think you're right. The individual push of markets tend to win almost all the time in that respect.
Yeah, and and I love my students, and some of them are so idealistic, but I'm like, we have to work within the reality that we have. And people need jobs, and we need things to be manufactured, and we need our cell phones, and where are those rare earth metals going to come from for our cell phones? Well, they're probably going to come in, at some point from the underneath in the Arctic, and so we have to work within the world that we have. We can make it better. I firmly believe that. And and we can, but we also have to recognize that we're now living in a massive global economic crisis because of COVID. It's not just the United States. So how do we continue to move forward, and how do we deal with the fact that the people of Bangladesh are already dealing with increased flooding, stronger storms, inundations, all that kind of stuff. We have to deal with that now, while at the same time trying to think about the future. And we have to deal with the Indigenous people, in the North who never asked for any of this. And how do we support them? And how do we support people who are dealing with the consequences of problems that they didn't create? That's the hard thing for me, I think, with all of this, is that the people who are most vulnerable in all this didn't do anything, like literally didn't create the greenhouse gas emissions that have led to these problems. So where's our social responsibility, and how do we step up, and how do we use the world we have to do that?
Thank you.
I just asked Terry and Rick to unmute. I think they may have a question.
There.
Yes. So is there any country that is doing something to help its people, like relocate or do anything like that? Is there any country working on that diligently? It doesn't seem like the United States is.
No. Sort of, but not really. But what's I think super interesting about what's going to have the biggest impact in the US is the insurance companies.
Oh,
The
yeah.
insurance companies are the ones who are going to get people to move out of the coastal areas. So, there are insurance companies who have pulled out of Miami, for instance, because they say, and the insurance company is super active at the climate change negotiations. They are all over because they are so worried about what's going to happen to them with climate change. And so a number of insurance companies have pulled out of Miami because they've said, because of climate change, there are going to be more hurricanes, and they're going to be stronger. We're already seeing this, right? They're going to be stronger and more frequent. And we don't want to insure people because we're going to have to pay out too much money. So when we think about the wildfires in California, right, which are becoming more frequent and stronger, which is all part of climate change, totally expected, nothing unusual, unfortunately, given our climate change experience. Insurance companies are going to stop insuring people who want to build homes in wildfire regions. And so I guess, it's like what you were just saying, Paul, like the idea of the market forces, right? So at least in the US, I think we're going to see the insurance companies really driving getting people away from these vulnerable areas. Now, does this work in Bangladesh? No. It only works in countries where you have insurance. And so in these other countries, it becomes more about development aid or, governments trying to step up. We've had in Canada, there have been some relocation programs in the past around for different reasons, or in kind of not in a punishing way, but they're incredibly expensive and incredibly complicated, and people don't want to move, and it's hard. Like if you live in a coastal, you live in Bangladesh, which is one of the most overpopulated regions of the world, and your home floods 6 months of the year, like you just splash through water. Where do you go? You can't just leave and go to another country because they won't take you, right? You can't just go and easily find work in another area that an urban area necessarily. Like you're gonna that takes a certain amount of money and access, and there have to be jobs, and there has to be housing and all of that kind of stuff. So the whole idea of like, well, people can just leave. Well, it's not that easy for people to just get up and leave. Where do they go? Who's going to take them?
Has any country stepped up to take some of the people that are on that island, Tupelo or whatever? Has any country said, come on in? No. How sad is that?
Yeah, and it's funny because Tuvalu, I love Tuvalu. They have an Australian journalist kind of took on Tuvalu as like his cause. His name is Ian, and he has become the spokesperson for Tuvalu. And so at these negotiations, he speaks on behalf of Tuvalu, and he's an impassioned speaker, and everybody is just captivated by what he says. and then kind of nothing really happens. Tuvalu actually ran out of water a couple years ago. And even though it's an island nation, they ran out of fresh water. It was a drought, and they basically were putting out calls to the world to bring them water. And Australia stepped up, but water is really heavy, and it's really heavy, and it's expensive to fly over, like in a helicopter, like with giant water bladders. And then the middle, I think it was Saudi Arabia, sent some desalination infrastructure so that they could do small amounts of desalination. So it was like this little bit, and then it rained, and so that solved that problem after about, it was like maybe a week or two that they didn't have water. But the world said, like, okay, well, Tuvalu, like you need to build infrastructure to store more rain. Like, you need to improve your reservoirs and do all that kind of stuff. And Tuvalu was like, great, we have no money, like, and we're fine, like we're not, but like we don't have money to do that extra stuff. That's a luxury. But it was interesting that the world kind of reluctantly stepped up and it helped, and it was Australia. So how many countries, refugee crisis, we start talking now about climate refugees, and people who are going to have to leave because of climate change, and who's willing to take them. And we've already seen, go ahead.
Aren't people from Central America kind of coming up here because they can't grow their coffee or whatever they grow? It's kind of like, climate related.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so
how does the Chinese government deal with this differently than other governments? Because I think they're less market influenced. Do they come across as any way different because of that?
Well, they kind of don't care. Their focus is not, the rural farmers who are, struggling with crops because of, drought. They're, when you're not democratically elected, you don't really have to listen to the people. And a lot of that is just kind of hidden, but, and the government really very much controls, the narratives about climate change, but they are super active, and they are very worried about the impact on their economies. And again, about their economy, right, is the driving force. And how are they going to sustain their economic development? Where are they going to get the particularly these rare earth metals that they need, minerals for their electronics production? Because China is looking at drilling on asteroids and on the moon, which is a whole other super awesome politics discussion right there. So if Great Decisions ever does one on commercialization of outer space, like I did my master's thesis on this, and it's fascinating. So China's already trying to figure out how to how, and it's worth it. Like, it's economically worth it for them to think about drilling on the moon, and bringing rare earth minerals back. And so drilling in the Arctic, it's a lot easier. At least you can breathe the air. So China, it's a fast, but again, like, they send huge delegations to these climate change negotiations. And there is this, so there's the politics side and the posturing and all that. But then at the same time, like, there's also all of this, like, side stuff and events where people are like, oh shoot, like, we've got people who are, farmers who cannot farm anymore. A lot of the, people have traced a situation in Syria back to droughts, and, people unable to feed their families. And so that was kind of the foundation of some of the tension that then bubbled up and exploded and ended up affecting the world, right? So, but people have attributed that if those droughts hadn't happened, we might not see this Syrian crisis, that we continue to deal with. Now, can we say for sure that it was because of climate change? No. But the odds are we're going to see more and more of this.
When people don't work, they have a lot of time to do all kinds of things. And if you've got a family, what are they supposed to do? Look at all the white supremacist things that are happening in the United States because maybe people aren't working.
If you can't feed your family, you know, how can you
Or
not be angry?
nothing to do.
Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting to see, like, you know, these impacts and how do we address them, right? And how do we address them, you know, domestically, and how do we address them internationally? Because all of these things, you know, start to impact us. So something as simple as, you know, some ice is melting actually has huge ramifications
Yeah.
for all of us.
Yeah.
Shannon, I would like to make a comment here that's not original, but one person has said, instead of asking a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? Ask them, when you grow up, what kind of world problem would you like to help solve? And I love that idea. And I think you're doing that in your job.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I feel so lucky. I love what I do. I love working with students. I love you know, I love all the great things that they do when they graduate too. Like, I feel just really lucky being here at BGSU. But I love that idea, and I'm going to ask my students that because I think that would be. I'll ask my 13-year-old daughter that too.
Yes.
Yeah. So and it's tough for her, you know. She's got you know, I get excited about things, and she knows a lot about things that she doesn't want to know about. As she can tell you all about melting sea ice and Arctic politics. But yeah, I mean, you know, kids today are different, and they want to make the world a better place. Like, you know, and they think it's just what you do. Like, they don't community service, volunteering, you know, they just assume that that's what you do. And I was Generation X. Like, we thought what you did was lie on the couch with a remote and watch TV, like, you know, when I was her age. So, you know, to see her friends, you know, and the kids here in BG, so many of them just saying, like, yeah, how I need to step up and do and care about things. It's very cool. We live in complicated times, but we live in some good times too.
That's refreshing.
Mhm. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Orr, for presenting today and fielding all of these questions. You did a wonderful job. If you are planning on joining us again, we have 2 more great decisions left. Next weekend, we will cover the end of globalization. So thank you again, Dr. Orr, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.
The end of